Very good evening, everyone, and welcome to JanyU Saturday Talk series. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Monish Tourangbam, a distinguished scholar and policy analyst working at the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and strategic affairs. Dr. Tourangbam is currently a fellow at the Chintan Research Foundation. He has previously served as a fellow at the Stimson Center and as an associate editor at India Quarterly, contributing extensively to discussions on global affairs, Asian geopolitics, and strategic policy. His work brings closely academic depth and policy relevance, making complex global developments accessible and analytically grounded. Today, he will be speaking on the theme A World Order Shaken and Stirred, where he will help us understand how the current global disputes and disruptions are shaping institutions, alliances, and strategic choices across nations and regions. Sir, we are honored to have you, and over to you, sir.
Thank you so much for a generous introduction. At least trying to make sense of what's happening around the world right now. I keep saying that I have never had so much agony in teaching international relations over the last 10 years or so, and also writing about it, not only because of the rapidity with which I think the world is changing around us, and it's no longer, I think, a preserve of people like us who are more or less professionals in the field, on our bread and butter by making sense of what's around the world, but even to inform audiences. I think many of you are more than informed. Insights into what's happening in certain sectors of the world, which will be equally illuminating to me also. So would rather be interested more in a two-way dialogue between those who represent here and me. All of you who have who watch James Bond, must have recognized the movie reference in my title, which is A World Order which is shaken and stirred, although 007 would often order his favorite martini as shaken, not stirred. But I believe that the world is both shaken and stirred at the same time as we look at it right now. And every day I am flabbergasted and I am very anxious as to what new decisions will be taken in the White House that would radically sort of like change, not things that we thought about 1 month before or 1 year before, but things we thought about even a day before. And I think that's the kind of rapidity and the speed with which things are changing around us that we are talking about. But I think it's also important, and perhaps that's why this dialogue is important, in the sense that how do we not get carried away by newspaper headlines? How do we not get carried away by reels, geopolitical reels and international relations reels that often pop up in our handheld devices, whether we like it or not? How do we not get carried away by YouTube influencers? And by no means I am trying to denigrate any of the YouTube influencers, but I think you also know that there are many who would pass on knowledge about what's happening around the world. I think that effort is more important to sort of try and make sense of some of the undercurrents of what is happening beyond the headlines and ask why questions, rather than looking at what questions. And I think we need to even go back, 100 years before, 50 years before, and see the continuities in the changes also, because there are many continuities if you look at it. If you look at the geopolitical headwinds that we are talking about, a lot of you must have, I think, either read or heard or intensely followed the kind of speeches that were made at the World Economic Forum in Davos, right? Not only the one that Mr. Trump made, which were groundbreaking in a sense, but also I think the Canadian Prime Minister's speech, Mark Carney's speech, has been doing the rounds quite a bit in terms of its content and in terms of the way he delivered it. And given the fact that it comes from one of the closest allies of the United States, comes to this stage and talks about a rupture in world order. Now, a lot of terms are being used, and I just referred to something that Mark Carney used, which is rupture. But then we need to ask ourselves, are we really witnessing a rupture in the world order? Are we witnessing a transition, a geopolitical, a geoeconomic, and a technological transition that we haven't witnessed in our lifetime? And what are the short-term and mid-term and long-term consequences of these transitions that we are talking about? A lot of people would say that it's not a rupture, it's a transition. A lot of people would say that there are definitely signs of rupture. So I think the kind of words that are being thrown to us in terms of the state of the world order is something that brings us here. And I think it is something that I think it interests everyone, right? Whether or not you are in this business of international relations or geopolitics. And I think we are living in an era where these interconnections are much intense than ever before. The interconnections were there before as well. Not the first time that we are finding interconnections between geopolitics and other things, but I think the intensity that which it has developed is quite strong, and we need to sort of like understand and talk about that. And I think for any informed dialogue about, like, when you hear news or read newspapers about the world order and say that it's rupturing, its fissures are there, it's fracturing, I think we need to ask, like, what is the world order anyway, right? A lot of Western leaders keep talking about the liberal international order. One of the historians, Neil Ferguson, said that it's neither too liberal nor too international, neither too orderly, right? The liberal international order. So what is this world order that we keep talking about? Was it ever so orderly in the first place, right? If we are saying that there's a rupture in the world order, what kind of a new order are we entering into? And what kind of values, cultures, material capabilities is going to inform the emergence of this new world order? So in order to, I think, talk about a new world order, we first of all need to talk about what constitutes world order. Is it the institutions that constitutes world order? Who develop these institutions in the first place, and for what purpose? Are these institutions breaking down, and do you see the seeds of new institutions coming in, or are we in a very, very uncertain transition phase where the cinders of the old order are there, but the seeds of the new order are not too clear as well, right? So I think that is something that we need to ask ourselves, and we can debate that what constitutes this world order. Is it the Bretton Woods institutes that constitutes this world order, or the many multilateral forums that came after it, the UN, for instance? All these kind of treaties that were formulated and negotiated in the last 70 years or so, do they constitute world order? Who makes sure that the world order remains relatively orderly? Like, do you require a hegemon in the first place to make sure that this order is orderly in the first place? So I think these are kind of questions that are very important in terms of going beyond the headlines, as I say, that what constitutes this world order? There's something inherently different between the world order and a national order, right? So when we come down to the national, sovereign, territorial nation state, there are many things that makes a national order. It could be constitution, it could be the kind of legislative, executive, judiciary mechanism that creates some kind of order, and it may be even like the values that create some kind of order in the system inside the national territory. Now, when we look at the world, we usually understand the world or world informed by an anarchic system, which means that there's no central authority, right? There's no elected world government. That makes, I think, the world order concept and its operationalization especially convoluted in some sense. How do you bring in the question of fairness, right? So whenever I used to enter and start teaching international relations, and students would often ask me, sir, the world is so unfair. How do you make sense of it, right? I would often say that, do you think, there's fairness in your life? Have you gotten what you desired in the first place, or what you think you deserve in the first? 90% of them would say no. So, and I would say that if your life itself is unfair, how can you expect fairness in the international system? So how do you bring fairness, the question of fairness itself? How do you bring equality, inclusivity? How do you bring an equity in the international system where you have economies who are 5-6 times bigger than many economies in the world? You look at the two biggest economies in the world and look at the third and the fourth biggest economies in the world, and you see the gap between them, not to talk about all the other smaller economies, right? So this sense of not being fair, this sense of like inequity, this sense of relative depravity, for example, is embedded in the international system. So that makes the constitution of a world order, that makes the operationalization and the sustaining of a world order equally challenging in some sense, right? So I think we need to sort of have a sense of this differentiation between what constitutes order in a national territory and what constitutes order in the international system. And then you ask, definitely come to the question of then what is that like? It's like, it's like that question of like, do you see orderliness in the international system when you see one? Or do you see a rupture or a breakdown of order in the international system when you see one? Right. So what makes someone question orderliness of a world order? Right. So it is not the first time that the world order has been questioned. It has been questioned over a period of time. The institutions have been questioned over a period of time, whether it is IMF, quota systems, or the representation of so-called the global south. At some point of time, they were called G77, and in the 1970s, inside the UN itself, you had things like the new international economic order, which were questioning the international economic architecture itself, right? So it's not the first time. You keep questioning the fairness, the inclusivity of this order. So what is so different now? I think, the kind of actions that the biggest economy and the biggest military power in the world has taken in the last 1 year is something so, fundamentally important in terms of understanding the speciality of the time that we are talking about, right? Why it is so intense now, unlike before, although over a period of time, we have been talking about this question of like how fair and how inclusive is the world order, and what role countries from the global south, including India itself, would play, for example, in a new world order. This kind of questions have been thrown around for quite some time, but in the last 1 year, you have seen the intensity with which it is being debated, right? So this question of, I think, liberal international order that the Western leaders keep talking about, that even Mark Carney in his speech at Davos sort of, they romanticize about it, right? And they repent the breakdown of that liberal international order and then blame Mr. Trump for much of the ruptures or the fissures and the cracks that they see in the liberal international order. But then again, for much of the majority of the world, was this liberal international order any liberal or international or orderly? Like who framed this idea of a Western value-led international order being liberal or international orderly in any sense, right? So I think this kind of questions have been thrown up for quite some time, but the uncertainty that has been brought to a large extent is also because it's being brought by a country which literally sort of like calls the shots in many cases of international relations, which is the biggest economy, foreign exchange reserves, the biggest military in the world, who can literally sort of like go to another continent and then get serving president in the middle of the night, right? So a lot of things are happening. It's on your TV screens every day. Tariffs, for instance, the kind of weaponization of tariff that is. I would even go further and say, as I've written often in my articles, that there is a weaponization of interdependencies in the last 1 year or so. That, when we started studying international relations, we sort of talk about like interdependence, that globalization created interdependence. But then how do you, when someone ends up weaponizing those interdependencies, then it creates a very different kind of economic architecture, right? Or rather, it sort of disrupts the whole economic architecture, whereby alliances and alliance commitments are no longer grounded on its moral and ethical dimensions. It's more about strategic bargaining of alliance commitments, that every alliances, every partnerships is then up for strategic bargaining, right? Now, that does two things, which is that on the one side, it sort of like lays bare a naked realism, which is that now okay, what the Americans really want. He doesn't have any velvet gloves, right? He makes no bones about calling allies free riders of the international system. So what are America's priorities, right? But on the other hand, with that clarity of priorities also comes the uncertainty of the arrangement with other countries, right? That countries are not only, I think, pushed in terms of looking at new negotiation with the United States, but also that there is a lot of uncertainty about what can you really expect from the United States in return, right? So I think it's a kind of a paradox, right? Where you have clarity of priorities of the US, but also you have a lot of ambiguity about like what to expect from that clarity, right? So I think there is a paradox in the international system right now, and that particularly makes it so difficult to grasp, though so difficult to make sense of, right? What's really happening around us. Do we have historical parallels of what's happening now? I think there are very less historical parallels because, again, trying to find historical parallels is also a very dangerous thing, right? Because history doesn't repeat itself in exactly the same context. For instance, right? If history sort of echoes and rhymes, it doesn't exactly repeat itself. So you might argue that this strand of US foreign policy behavior of strategic bargaining and calling allies and partners to pull up their socks and do more, and sort of like saying that your autonomy counts as long as it aligns with American interests. And then this sort of militant reading or interpretation of Make America Great Again and America First, and then other countries sort of responding to this vast use of American executive power is something we often say that, well, you can go back and find these strands also, right, in the interwar period or just before, like America, just before the Second World War started, and after the Second World War, when the US sort of like was more globalist in terms of founding many of these institutions, what now constitutes the world order. So you do find strands of US foreign policy, which might explain some of this behavior, right, that everyone is undergoing through. But this is also a very interesting or a very important phase in international relations in terms of understanding how other countries are responding to this let's say, unapologetic use of American power, right? So it's almost a very unapologetic use of American power without any consideration of the second order effect, without any consideration of how it will be perceived among allies and partners or even adversaries, right? So I remember when I was a grad student in JNU, I picked up this book by one of the American political scientists, Stephen Walt, and he wrote this book called Taming American Power. The time in which it was written, like post-Cold War, there was a moment of unipolarity where there was no competitor for the United States. So he was writing at a time questioning, now, if US is the most powerful country in the world after the demise of the Soviet Union and if there's no competitor, how would other countries respond to use of American power? So he was questioning this idea of, can American power be tamed by response from other countries at a time when there is no singular power equal in capability to the US. Now, you transport that arrangement here, right? What kind of a world we are into? The Russian power is a formidable military power which can withstand sizable days of military confrontation, as we have seen in the Ukraine-Russia war. But it's it's a very minuscule part or a circumscribed part of what the Soviet Union used to be, right? So at best, you have Russia as a regional power, yes, with the largest amount of nuclear warheads, which is very head-bent on preserving its sphere of influence. You have China, I think, galloping up there in terms of matching the American economy and finally overtaking it. But not to the extent of the military expeditionary power that would really sort of like put a challenge to the Americans. Although in the new national defense strategy that the Trump administration brought out very recently, they do acknowledge that China is the second most powerful country in the world, according to the American perception, and it is relatively the most important challenger to US primacy, right? So you bring that thing here, that how powerful are the Americans at this point of time, and the repercussions of the use of American power. And by this, I mean both economic coercive power of tariffs as well as the military power to carry out expeditionary sort of operations the way they want it. So I think we are passing through that very unsettled moment of the use of American power and how other countries would respond to it and how Americans would counter response to that response from other countries. So I think we are passing through that kind of a very, volatile phase of some sort. So in that case, the role of a hegemon or the role of the most powerful country at any given point of time in international relations becomes a very important vector to understand the volatility of the world order that we are talking about. the instability of the world order we are talking about, the behavior of the hegemon at that point of time, and the responses from others, right? And I think that really reflects the power symmetry or asymmetry in the international system. That is there any other power in the international system, or is there a group of powers in the international system that can really push back the Americans, or any hegemon at that point of time? I'm not really singling out the Americans here. I'm just using it as a example because that's the reality right now, right? So it raises a very important question in that sense, that why is it happening so? Is it the structure? And by this, I mean, is it the international system, the way it is structured, for instance, as an anarchic sort of a thing, very conflictual, right? Is it because of that structure that the international system is inherently volatile, right? Or is it because of the changes happening in the state systems, right? Where the democracies are behaving in certain ways, where, like non-democratic countries are behaving in certain ways. So is it because of the political systems in this, or is it because of personality? Now, Mr. Trump really fits into that analytical framework, right? That is it because of Mr. Trump, or is it that America was anyway passing through certain kind of churn or changes which would have brought someone like Trump on the fore? And is it really, it is not really because of the personality? But I'm just raising questions here, right? Is it because of the international system here, or is it because of the political systems in these countries, or is it because of personality? Trump, Xi Jinping, you can now put in, for instance, right? So is it because of personality? Is it because of the rise of a personality like Trump, which has led to this kind of, I think, transition in the world order that we are talking about? This leads us to the question of polarity again, right? You must have often heard about the world coming to be a multipolar world where a lot of powers are there, not just one or two. And we were all discussing about that. Oh, multipolarity. The world is no longer bipolar or unipolar. But then I think it begs a question that are we actually passing through a phase of multipolarity, or are we in the illusion of multipolarity? That, there is an illusion of multipolarity, that the global south is rising, a lot of countries are there. But then if you, as I said before, if you compare the two most powerful countries of the world, which is US and China, their military power, their hard power, their influence, their economic power to the rest, is there a big gap? If that gap is big enough, then are we really talking about a multipolar order? So are we passing through then kind of an asymmetric multipolar order, right? Where you have a lot of powers, who does influence the international system, but then they may not be so powerful and so close to the two most powerful countries in the world, and hence there's an asymmetry of power, and you're passing through some kind of asymmetric multipolarity, unbalanced multipolarity, calling it, right? So I think these are important questions to ask as we try to make sense of the world order that we are passing through. And I think the kind of things which are happening, which constitutes the world order, whether it's the economic arrangement or whether it's a security arrangement, it impinges on national policies, it impinges on businesses, it impinges on tech ecosystems. It impinges on defense ecosystems. It impinges on climate mitigation ecosystems, right? So a lot of things get affected because when you question the world order, you are also questioning the effectiveness of multilateralism, right? The effect. So you are in fact going through a crisis of multilateralism. Then you can ask again, why is it so, and all those things. Are decision making changing in substantial ways? Are we passing through a phase of bilateral arrangements where many of these institutions become irrelevant? So it's a very, very volatile time, and I was writing this piece where I quoted these lines from Charles Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities, that the worst of times and the best of times, right? Winter of despair and the spring of hope, and we all were going right to heaven, and we are all going right the other way, right? So I think that paradox that was inherent in when he wrote around the time of European Industrial Revolution, and you can see a lot of that uncertainty, that churning, the manthan that we keep talking about. So, we are in a deep churn in that sense. And my last point before I end this and would like to talk more interact more, is we know that the context is rapidly changing in front of our eyes. And what does that do for people like us is that then we go on a quest for frameworks, new frameworks. And that becomes a very difficult enterprise. That when the context is changing rapidly, how do you find a framework, right? When you find that the framework that you used to, the tools, the playbook that you used to, both for an academic understanding as well as for policymakers around the world, are failing or are not working, right? So you search for new tools in your toolbox and don't find them, or you find them, or you reimagine the use of the same tools that are in your toolbox and see how they can be used differently. And if you do a cursory examination of the lexicon of international relations in the last 1 year, the one word that will jump out to you is diversification, right? Trade diversification, all those kind of things that we keep hearing every day, that countries are essentially trying to create redundancies. Countries are essentially planning for plan B and C and D even as they work on their plan A, right? So a lot of that is happening around us. The context is rapidly changing, and I think we are all in that quest to find that framework to understand what's happening around us. So I'll stop here, I think, Mayank, and then I'll be happy to take questions and also learn from many of you who might have comments.
I think we have a few questions. Some of them might relate to economics and migration, especially since we're engineers. And some of them will be more on the economic and business side. But I think the core idea will definitely be, recognizing the volatility of our times. So, sir, the first question will be from me. Since you talked about Charles Dickens and The Tale of Two Cities, I think I'll also have to flex my literature hat. Someone who read parts of the Iliad by Homer, theme was always about the cyclicity of things like horror, revenge, and rivalry, and sometimes even generational conflicts, right? So the first thing I want to know from you, sir, is that the world has been in churn since millennia. So what is so unique about this time? Why is this time so fundamentally different? Why do people feel so uncertain in days today as compared to maybe how they felt in earlier times when, let's say, the Cold War was there, or let's say when great power rivalries were there before? And my next question will be from slightly different perspective, perhaps maybe an Orwellian perspective. So very recently I was having a conversation with someone from Nepal, and they were sharing their views regarding their uncertainty about what the world order has for them. If you look at a concentration of capital flow and artificial intelligence, countries that are already doing well, let's say those that are there in the global north, such as America, they have money to invest in artificial intelligence. AI is a disruptive force not only in terms of geopolitics and security, but also economics. So a lot of people are worried that now jobs will not come to India, and instead US will be able to automate a lot of tasks. So, sir, do you think that this new world order has more concentration and control over institutions of power and technology than, let's say, what was happening earlier?
I really believe in this cyclical patterns that that the world passes through. And I think the uniqueness of the times that we are talking about is just that every generation thinks, the transition that they show in their times were the most unique, right? So I believe that is the case for us, in the sense that if we were to go back and look at, for example, the turn of the century, right? Like, the US emerges as a world power. Many of the countries around the world are still under colonial domination, but industrial revolution is sort of shifting from England to USA, and then in Western Europe to Germany and perhaps to Japan. If you were to look back at that, you would, someone living in that period would have felt the same kind of uncertainty and churn and all those things, right? If we look back in a hindsight, the phase between the two world wars, and also right after the World War II, people would have felt that kind of churn. I feel what is so unique, Mayank, is that we are in a period where we know about these changes, or at least, I know will be a very big word, but at least, we are open to this information overload real time, right? So people who were living, common people at least, citizens who were living under either the colonial domination, before decolonization started, or even people in the Western world who were more, let's say, have access to certain things, would have never known the kind of things that were moving around them, right? So I think we live in a period where we have real-time information. And I think that in a way increases anxiety among a lot of people, because you open the television or you open your phone, even if you don't want to watch television, news, it's there on your phone, right? Reels are coming in every time, even when a Maduro is being taken to, US, or things are happening in Iran, or things are sort of like happening fast, in Gaza or other places. People are seeing this real time. So even if you do not have insider knowledge, or even if you do not have informed knowledge about any of these things that are happening around the world, either in form of reportage or either in form of like people giving their thoughts on it, you are seeing this every day in front of you. So I think what is so unique about the time that we are passing through is not just in terms of the scale in which it is happening, which is that it's a much more interdependent world than in any of the crisis period. Many of the issues that we are talking about, which are being affected by this poly crisis sort of a thing, is that they are all connected to each other. I don't think that was the case in earlier periods, even when you would seen a crisis, right? So that is one. But I think in my mind, the most important unique thing about this time is our access to knowledge, right? Our access to information, of how things are changing around us. Even though we do not have an answer to it, we still see it in front of us. We still feel the impact of it real time, right? So I think that's why it's so unique, that it's no longer an elite level discussion. It's something that even a local television channel in Manipur or in Bihar, people would be sitting and talking about geopolitics, right? People would be sitting and talking about like the impact of Trump, for instance. So I think that is very unique of the times that we are living in. The second question about that's true. I think again, it will be very hard to put our finger on it and say how it will pan out. But all that we are seeing now really reflects. I think one of the things about technologies of any way, right? It may be AI, or because AI is, I think it's the latest one in a long list of many disruptive technologies that have defined civilizations or nation states over a period of time, whether it's conflicts or cooperation or anything. One of the first things that you would notice when a new technology comes to the fore is that some countries try to monopolize it, of course, right? They have the resources to do so. There will be a pushback from some countries, again, a select group of countries who have the means to do that pushback because they want a pie of it, right? And then over a period of time, the first movers will also realize that eventually this diversification is going to happen, that you can't stop technologies from percolating down forever, right? Then they will create or institutionalize certain things, right? It might be in the form of multilateral treaties, it might be in the form of bilateral arrangements where you are distributing public goods in the international system. You are still, at the top of the apex of the pyramid, but you know that if you don't do this, there will be pushback and it will not be sustainable for your own dominance itself. So I think this has happened before, right? New technologies coming in, there's a question of distribution of that. So the thing about technologies is that it does not enter a political vacuum. It enters a space which is already politically contested, right? In terms of the hierarchy of the systems, in terms of like who gets what, in terms of like, if I am at the low pecking order, what do I get in response? And what do I give in response? I think you use the example of Nepal, for instance, right? The Gen Z movement in Nepal was very interesting in terms of the churn that it brought out, that technology and access to knowledge and the idea of relative deprivation that comes when you have access to knowledge of lifestyle in other countries was like inherently at the very important part of what happened in Nepal. So I think we are at the very beginning of this whole idea of automation in terms of its impact on the job markets and other things, right? We are still trying to understand what is going to be the impact in real. So I don't have a clear-cut answer to that in terms of how that redistribution is going to happen. My skeptic mind tells me that there is going to be a repetition of the similar stories of tech systems that we have seen in earlier period, and countries will find their space and where at their intervention points in this new tech system that we are seeing also.
Hi, Monish sir. Really enjoyed your lecture and your thoughts related to economic order of international relations. Many Indians are concerned about what is happening in the United States, especially regarding the strength of the economy and various educational and job opportunities. Firstly, I want to know about your thoughts on this aspect. Secondly, on a deeper level, can migration governance become a pillar of international economic cooperation, similarly to trade rules and financial coordination, or will it remain primarily a sovereignty-driven domain?
Rajesh, these questions, I think it's one of the most, I think, important emerging areas of interstate cooperation or the kind of negotiations which are happening, because labor mobility of different levels of skills are going to be more important. India has been, you see that many of the FTAs that India has negotiated in recent times, not only with the European Union, but there was one with New Zealand and many of the Gulf countries. Outcome of many of these negotiations in terms of their ratification and also in terms of how they really operationalize in the times to come is something that we have to wait and watch, because these FTAs, many of these FTAs are announcements of FTAs. In many cases, they will have to face some kind of ratification back home in their own parliaments before they really operationalize. And FTAs are never things which are cast in stone, right? There are certain agreements, there are certain things which are worked out, but things can be more dynamic. So, but having said that, what you raise is going to be one of the most important areas of negotiation between India and many of these countries which are facing demographic decline. So demography is also going to be one of the most important debating points in interstate cooperation or negotiation in the years to come, in terms of like the absorption capacity of many of these countries. I think even when Putin came to India, there were discussions of labor mobility in terms of like the absorption of Indian working youth population and all those things, especially because I am sitting in Manipur right now, especially Japan, because of its demographic decline again, is very much interested in workforce, especially from this part of India, for elderly care and all those things and many other job areas. So in terms of highly skilled labor, there's also like it's very much a big component of again the India EU FTA that has just been announced. So I think this sharing of talent pool that you mentioned, and at what level we are talking about, because when we say labor mobility pacts that India is going to negotiate with many countries, it is going to talk about skill at different levels, right? Lower skill level and higher skill level, and what are the intervention and entry points of each of these skill levels. The things that are going to be discussed and work out is also the platforms of negotiation for any dispute. So when you sign a labor mobility pact with any country, you try to then institutionalize, or you try to create some order. Since we're talking about world order, create some order in the arrangements, create new terms of arrangement that if my people go to this country in this sectors, what are some of the terms of engagement that we are going to talk about. So definitely I think you will see a lot of discussion on this aspect in the years to come as we go about negotiating this FTAs. I think this, from a geopolitical point of view, it's also an interesting way to look at the behavior of the US, not only to India but to even its European allies. You keep hearing news about this, or Greenland, and Trump putting more tariffs, right? The European Union pushing it back again by passing this, operationalizing what they call as the anti-coercion trade activities within the EU Parliament. So all of this are going on. So this diversification that I mentioned earlier is also countries pacing ahead and putting their foot in the pedal in order to do certain things which they might have taken for granted, or they might have kicked the can down the road for a future negotiation. India EU FTA, for instance, it has been negotiated since the time I started. I was a student. I just entered this field 25 years or something. So what pushed India and EU towards? So this is another digression, but the thing that you mentioned is fairly important in times to come. Vasanji's question about Russia-Ukraine war and American Board of Peace, that's $1 million question for every, I think, person who studies international relations, that what is the role of the UNO really? And I think the UNO, that is the crisis that we are talking about, right? That at the very center of what they call as the liberal international order, or what the post-World War II world order, if we may put it that way, right? The post-World War II world order. At the center of that world order was the creation of the UN itself, right? And despite all the other appendages and agencies of the UN, whether it's it's wildlife, or whether it's UNESCO and all those things, right? Hey, but the central point of the foundation of the UNO was this idea of security, right? Idea of balance of power, idea of preventing another crisis of that magnitude from happening. And then, yes, for the last 70 years or so, we haven't had a systemic war where, the great powers of the day were really fighting a hot war. You had proxy wars here and there. Were the UN really effective in, let's say, preventing all those proxy wars? No, right? But you are right in pointing out that at least in the last few years, the UN has been totally absent, right, from the radar, right, and which I think is putting more and more nails on the coffin of the UN, which was already designed. The coffin of the UN was already designed before, in the sense that people were already questioning its relevance in doing the one thing for which it was created in the first place, which relates to international security order. So apart from all the other things that it keeps doing, that is the one purpose for which it was created. But I think it has sort of literally been absent from that, and that creates the space for the United States, and particularly the Trump administration, to talk about many of these other arrangements, right, which definitely is not, I think, going to supplant the structure of the UN in any time soon. But I think the fractures that we are talking about, the fracturing of the UN is at the very center of that. And you see that in terms of like how it's becoming more irrelevant. I think the last question about US immigration, again, this is something over which we can have an hour-long discussion in terms of what's really happening there. You see the kind of things that the immigration ICE, as they call it, which are happening in Minnesota and other places. Now, it is not the first time again that in the history of the US migration has become an issue. If we just go back to history, every new hordes of immigration that comes into the US starts being seen with skeptical eyes by people who are already there, right? So it's a very cyclic thing again in US immigration history. But at this point of time, the kind of things which are happening, it's little mind-boggling, right? In the sense of, especially I see a lot of tension between the federal government and the state government, right, in the US itself. That right. The federal government has a certain approach to migration. Each state government might have a certain approach to migration, right? So I think that's something that we have to watch out for. Whether migration governance will really become the centerpiece of international cooperation is something I think it's required, but its time is still to come. We are at the very center of this crisis right now. So to foresee migration governance which can bring countries together, I think it's a little far-fetched now, in the sense that it's on not only the US, but the impact of the US approach to migration is even being felt in the European countries also, where there might be a lot of political pushback against parties which might be more open to international migration. So it's a very, very uncertain period in terms of looking at international migration, uncertain period in terms of looking at, again, this very well connects to even the question that Rajeshji put in the first place, labor mobility, right? When you have countries pushing back against migration of both skilled and low skilled labor, how do you negotiate labor mobility to help each other in that sense? So these are, I think, the questions of our times. That are big questions.